Good afternoon. My name is Csaba Gondola. I'm the moderator of this panel. It's great to be here. Thanks a lot. I appreciate the invitation, and I think we have a couple of questions and themes in here that could not be more relevant. The central question of our panel, before I introduce the distinguished panelists, is how can Central and Eastern Europe navigate its energy transition away from the Russian import dependence and toward a greener and more secure energy future? So the speakers will aim to provide a comprehensive overview of the challenges and opportunities that Europe is facing currently, especially with the highlight of Central Europe. So let me introduce you Paul Domjan, founder and Chief Policy and Global Affairs Officer from Enoda, London. Please give him a round of applause. Frank Umbach, Head of Research at EUCERS, CASSIS, University of Bonn. And Georg Zachmann, Senior Fellow at Energy and Climate Department from Bruegel Institute, Brussels. So what we try to elaborate in here is basically the impact of the shift away in our region from the Russian energy, the cheap energy that was fueling European industries for decades, first of all. And second, we try to highlight on the topics of diversification in our region, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges and what the options are available for us. Then we will turn into the renewable energy sources and discuss what this green transition, or at the European Union policy Green Deal particularly means for our region in terms of finance, in terms of industry, in terms of competitiveness. And if we have some time, then we would like to talk about new technologies like SMR, small modular reactors, and perhaps the role of the American LNG in Europe. So at the second half of the panel or the workshop, of course, we're going to open the floor for questions. I would kindly ask you to, when you raise your questions, we don't have this tool. We just feel free to raise your hand and please indicate your name and affiliation. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and inputs about the questions that was already mentioned. And I would turn to you, first of all, to discuss the first question is what the shift away or the decoupling from the Russian energy means for Europe especially and for our region. Domjan, please.
Certainly. So I think 20 years ago I was sitting at NATO as the energy security advisor to the US European commander, NATO commander. And what became very clear at the time was that on the one hand, the only real future for Europe to have a domestic supply of energy is a renewable energy future. And that remains true today. The problem is that the only system we have for delivering renewable energy is the electricity grid. And when William Stanley and Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse built that 138 years ago, they didn't build it with renewables in mind. And today we have this challenge that, the shift to renewable energy is really driven by a policy impetus. Every single technology transition in history, and we see this very clearly today with the AI transition, has begun with innovators developing something new, and then policy trying to catch up, and indeed business trying to catch up to understand how to use that new thing. And that's exactly what we see with AI. But the energy transition went the other way around. It began with a policy impetus, and innovation has had to catch up. So I would argue in some ways part of the challenge is your last question about new technologies kind of needs to come first, because even if we diversify away from Russian hydrocarbons, we're still not addressing the energy transition challenge. We're not moving to domestic sources of supply, and we're still tied to the vagaries of international prices. So the challenge for this, the challenge is, how do we get to a system where Central European consumers can benefit from not just domestically produced energy, but domestically produced and affordable energy? And the only way to get there is a combination of renewables and new technology to drive down prices. Now, that creates in many ways an opportunity for the region. And that opportunity ties to what we just heard about the 3 Cs. In this region, we have an underinvested energy system. We have underinvested infrastructure across a whole range of areas. That means, with due respect to my German colleagues, there's an opportunity to learn from what's been done elsewhere in early adopters and move directly to the solutions that might work most appropriately, an opportunity to leapfrog as that new infrastructure is built. So the region really is at a crossroads between, do you choose to double down on the old world of hydrocarbons and diversify, building new infrastructure, which we know is not going to be needed in the long term, or can the region work together to address that challenge of underinvestment, but do it by leapfrogging to an infrastructure that's ready for the future? And I think we see some good examples across the region of doing that, particularly the way in which, if you look towards Poland, you have the combination of one of the fastest renewable build-outs in Europe, a tremendous focus on building a grid that not just will work for today, but can support the electrification of the future, plus a commitment to build nuclear, but to build nuclear in a way that can be done more cost effectively, as opposed to effectively re-engineering every power plant from the beginning. So I think there are lessons there in the region that can be applied more broadly.
Thank you. If Frank, you would like.
Yeah, firstly, let me thank the organizers, in particular Rika, for inviting me. When she called me up, I had no other chance than just to follow her invitation. As we are being close friends, I think for almost 30 years or so, from my NATO time. So, first remark is related more a conceptual issue. Sounds a little bit academian one, but it has many practical implications. I'm not always sure when we're speaking about energy security of today what we really mean and whether we have a common understanding. Yeah, energy security historically had been related almost exclusively with oil security. Since 2006, of course, gas supply security had been included. But today it's much, much wider. We need a much more comprehensive, holistic view on those things. Of course, climate security played a role. NATO, for example, the department with whom I'm working very closely since more than 10 years as being a consultant, has added climate security, fortunately, in the same department. And cybersecurity, another issue of critical energy infrastructures, has become, for at least when I began to work 15 years ago, and might be still underestimated to some extent. Physical protection of critical infrastructure was something we and the industry missed for a long time. Yeah, I'm glad I was recently one of the authors of a transatlantic report which came out to the latest NATO summit, which were addressing a number of new issues such as maritime critical energy infrastructures, internet cables, electricity cables you need from wind power, offshore wind power plants going to the coast. So all these issues had never been addressed from a safety and security point of view, neither by the policies and governments nor by the industry. And today, as our report highlighted and had been already mentioned, we see an increasing number of physical sabotage from Russian secret services, including in my own country. There's still a reluctance on the side of the governments to reveal that, to discuss that openly. But as the deputy president of the German domestic secret services said recently to me, we need to do it not just also in preparing our own population, including the industry, what's actually going on. It's also, and I found it remarkably, that this is somehow undemocratic, so to speak. Yeah? This was running against his own understanding what a democracy is. So here again, that has become ever more important, of course, in the light of the broader Russian framework, as we have already heard it, about hybrid warfare. There are a number of problems such as attribution, because Russian secret services are mostly not doing those sabotage attacks themselves. They're using proxies from the very right and very left wing political forces we have in our own countries. And that makes the attribution at the very end also difficult, also for the governments and secret services, who is really behind that. But there are common structures and proofs. I don't want to go too much in detail. Critical raw materials have also been mentioned, and that brings me to also some of an important understanding in a way that geopolitics, like in my own countries for a long time, have only been attributed to fossil fuels. So the argumentation and assumption was, with the end of the fossil fuel age, there are no geopolitical risk. And critical raw materials are proof it's the opposite. Yeah? When I'm looking to the dependencies of the European industry on critical raw materials, then the dependency on China, particularly not just on the mining stage, but even more on the refining and processing stage, is even much, much higher. And that needs to be reflected against the background. The faster you go ahead with a green energy transition for climate policies and other reasons, the higher is the demand on critical raw materials. So if you take an electric car, for example, it needs 6-7 times as much as critical raw materials as a conventional engine. Yeah? So there is a very risk that we're going here from one geopolitical, geoeconomic dependencies to another one, which might be even more problematic than we have experienced already with the old one. And the understanding is still, at least in the broader recognition of our public debate, still not there. When we speak about, I remember just coming from an industrial conference in Germany where I had to give a presentation on supply chain risk and dependencies, and raw materials, of course, played a role. And it remembered me with a lot of assumptions we had at the beginning of the 1990s, the sharing of international labor in our understanding of globalization. And the former advisor, I think, of Bill Clinton put it with the slogan, "It's economy stupid." So foreign security, geopolitics doesn't matter. We don't need even armed forces. So it's only, in a narrow sense, economics matter. Today, I would put the opposite. Yeah, I would argue it's geopolitics stupid. Yeah, something which we still have to learn, and particularly the industry has to learn, like in Germany, the pillar of the German industry are medium-sized companies. So the bigger ones, that might be something which they have already learned, at least to some extent. But for the medium-sized company, it's a huge, huge challenge because, for example, they have never really addressed their own supply chains. And now they have to do it, but primarily for environmental reason, human rights, and have a huge reporting obligation and a bureaucratic task to do that, but without recognizing that the geopolitical risk built inherent in those supply chains is something which they have to be addressed for the very first time in their own business interest. And that's still a huge, huge challenge. LNG, very shortly, I think Germany is a perfect example. When we're speaking about the gas crisis, for example, and the explosion of the gas prices worldwide, in particular in Europe, it's very often referred, that is a result of the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion. but actually it's much more the result of our failing policies of building up diversified imports. And I give you an example, and Georg can continue on those issues. We discussed in Germany also for 30 years to build LNG terminals. One of the present newly built terminals or leased terminals is in Wilhelmshaven, in an area which had been envisaged to build an LNG terminal 30 years ago. It never happened. And the reason was, in my humble opinion, twofold. Firstly, there was the argumentation of the government for a long time, and sometimes you have still these argumentation, well, supply security, you can leave it to the markets and to the industry. The state should not intervene. Foreign security policies, geopolitics doesn't matter. The industry, like the German gas industry, was to some extent so much dependent on Gazprom that they were basically given in. When we had the first discussions on LNG terminals, of course that was not in the interest of Russia and Gazprom. Yeah, and then I think the last time when we really discussed that on the industry side, that was more approximately 15 years ago, and the industry was argue, well, we didn't really get support by the state. Then Mrs. Merkel came in 2016-17 by proposing to build LNG terminal, but this was basically a reaction to the Trump criticism of Nord Stream. Then when Trump lost the elections, the issue was no longer being pursued, etc. If we would have built LNG terminals, let's say in 2010, and with a mix of long-term contracts and short-term ones, then we wouldn't have a need to import such an amount of natural gas for a replacement of the pipeline gas. Then we would never have this kind of price explosion. And that's something which not only impacted, of course, Germany, because the price implosion was affecting the rest of Europe, and Germany was facing accusation, why you didn't build up LNG terminals as the rest of Europe, as the European Commission has recommended for many, many years. So you could have avoided that. So it was basically the result of our failing policies. And that brings me to the point, and maybe I should stop there, and that's related a little bit also to Hungary and the whole discussions. In NATO, we have discussed the LNG dependence in the annual Energy Security Roundtable, which is always taking place in December for at least 2-3 years. Including sometimes with the industry. And you could always hear we cannot give up LNG supplies. As Georg will certainly confirm, this is not true. You have other options available. They might be not built overnight. They are sometimes also costly. But at the very end, it's a question of political will. Yeah, nothing else. I would never accept something else. I can fully understand the cost issue. I can fully understand that we need some time. I have defended actually the Hungarian argumentation back in 2022 that they need more time to rebuild the diversification, etc., like Austria too. But what we see from outside today is that we don't see a real political will, neither in Hungary nor in Slovakia, and certainly not in Austria. Yeah, and what we also have to learn, and this is normally what I have argued for years towards my German countrymen, is what we have here in Europe integrated gas and electricity markets. So whatever we do in our national policies will have an impact not on our markets but on the entire EU markets, etc., including also the geopolitical implications. And that's not just true for big countries such as Germany, it's also true for the smaller ones. So whatever Hungary and other countries are doing, and I would add sometimes even more what they not do, has implications for the rest of Europe. And so every national member state, including the smaller ones, have here specific responsibilities which go beyond their own national borders. And we still have to learn to recognize that. And I'm saying that as a German because I repeat that still towards my German countrymen and the German government. And here again, we need some kind still to have of a European transatlantic vision, which we shouldn't lose out of our sight. Yeah, we won't solve the problems, and specifically not related, of course, to China and our supply chain dependencies we have, like in the critical raw material sector, but as well as others, because they are even more worse. And neither Germany as a bigger country, nor a smaller country in Europe will be able, politically, economically, to solve that problem. And that means when we speak about sustainability, this is not just a dimension of environmental and climate policies. Sustainability or resilience is also a dimension of energy security, and we need still to recognize it. And I'm stopping here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your horizontal view, and of course it's undeniable that Germany has a leading role in this, and I believe that Germany catch up with the 10 years or 15 years you mentioned, because they bought 2 or 3 LNG from China, by the way, but managed to secure that. And it is really important what you said with the critical materials as well, but the finer products too, that most of the European countries, for example, Germany buys 86% solar panels from China. So it's a new form of dependency that is emerging that needs to be addressed. And if you might add a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Csaba, and thanks a lot also to Reka for bringing me out of my Brussels bubble here, and hope we can have an interesting debate on the different perspectives. So, taking a very Brussels perspective, of course, I would say that the dealing with the energy crisis in the past 3 years has been a tremendous success of Europe, has been a tremendous success of the internal market. And let me, together with you, look a bit back where we were in 2022. Some member states were close to 100% dependent on Russian oil, others were close to 100% dependent on Russian gas, others were close to 100% dependent on Russian coal. France has lost half of its nuclear power plant fleet in this horrible year. So we were in a situation that if you would have looked at it from, say, 2020 perspective, you would have said, this thing is going to explode. And we managed to keep it together, and I think that is a success that is not necessarily due to kind of national policy making, but it was due to coordination, and essentially 2 parts of coordination: market coordination and political coordination. And I think the 2 showed there to work together extremely well. What I mean by that is we needed to reduce our consumption in many of those fuels, because it was impossible to bring the same amount into Europe. How did we do that? We let prices rise, and it was extremely painful. We have the discussions here in this country, in France, in Germany, in all countries about these rising prices. Should we not cap the prices in order to protect population? But there was not enough energy. We needed to reduce demand, and we decided to largely let markets work in rationing this demand to give it to those sectors that needed it the most. And it worked. At the same time, as there was this very, very strong impulse of individual member states to say, well, I like to subsidize my consumers, then they can buy this remaining energy from the other countries, that would have exploded the European Union. Because it would have meant that if Germany would have opened the pockets, handed out the money to its industry, buying the gas and the electricity from all its neighboring countries, we would have been able to outbid all others, and it would have meant that they would have closed the borders, the internal market would have failed, and we would not have managed to survive the crisis. So it was extremely important that there was this high trust relationship and also commitment at the European level to say we reduce gas consumption by 20% as a political agreement, because that protected us against this impulse of starting to out-subsidize each other. This is a very fragile compromise, and we are still in this period of discussion. To which degree do we allow member states to subsidize their energy consumers? And that's essentially reflected very strongly in the Draghi report. If you look into the Draghi report, it says Well, we have a big problem with our energy-intensive industry because of high prices, but the worst thing we could do is leave it to the member states to use electricity market regulation, some taxation tools, some free allowances, some indirect cost allocation. There is 101 tools, and certainly you can confirm, to make sure that your individual consumers gets a better deal outside of what DG Competition is looking at. And if we cannot stop that from happening, the market will implode. The European market will implode because some member states will have just deeper pockets, and you get into this dilemma. So when we learn something from this crisis is infrastructure is very, very crucial. And if we would have had more infrastructure like the LNG terminals, infrastructure that is there for insurance that is not based on the market, pipelines that are empty, that is crucial, and we need to have trust, and we need to have markets. Last point on trust, before we can then go to the second round, is sanctions are part of the trust, because sanctions are giving the key to Russian energy to Brussels. And this is important, because it cannot be that individual member states can go to Moscow and make deals with them, get them cheap energy, and undermine the trust in the entire European Union. This is really, really, really coercive for us as a bloc. And if we as a bloc fail, we will be individual countries, and the power of Europe lies in its unity. Otherwise, we are going to be kind of eaten piece by piece. And I'm very, very concerned about that. And that's not only pointing finger at this country, it's also pointing fingers at my country, because Germany has also opposed sanctions on Russian natural gas imports. We don't do them currently, but we have not accepted to have any sanctions on natural gas imports. And I think there is a strong case to be made. We have a window of opportunity now to put the key for future Russian gas into Brussels, because that helps everybody to have more credibility into investment decisions. And it does not mean for me necessarily that we have a zero Russian energy policy. It just means that this needs to be decided at the European level, not that each individual member state is allowed to play its own little games, because the temptation that is given to us from the other side is just too high, too strong, and it's impossible for individual governments in their electoral cycle to withstand it. So let's just try to tie ourselves to the mast and sail in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's what you said. There's a lot of pro and cons, and unfortunately, sanctions regimes are not the topic of our discussion, because it would take 2 additional hours, I believe. But I think it's really important what you just mentioned, that the infrastructure is basically an insurance. It's kind of like an expensive insurance, but when the time is there and you don't have it, then you pay twice at least, or even worst. So the next round of questions are regarding the new partnerships the region and the whole continent is facing. All the diversification routes are well known. It typically depends on what side of the continent you live in. Of course, we see that Norway came in drastically. The North African countries, even South American countries, the Gulf countries are there, and they are exporting, as Europe is really an energy intense continent. They exporting whatever they can. How you see the prospects, the opportunities, and the challenges of our region, especially as it was said before, that in the light of trading some sort of dependency to another source or sort of dependency. Let's go that way back.
Maybe for the sake of continuing my provocations, one more. There are parts in Europe that will be the winners of the energy transition, because they are endowed with the energies that are going to be the cheapest energies in the next decades. And there are other regions that used to have a lot of coal, which has become expensive, that used to have pipelines to countries that provided them with relatively competitive gas. And those countries built on these historic resource endowment an energy-intensive industry. And of course, the political economy in those countries is very strongly to maintain the energy-intensive industry in those places where it used to be. The Ruhr area in Germany being one very, very strong example. So when in the Ruhr area coal became too deep in the 1960s, they started to build nuclear power plants that were subsidized by population. They started to build pipelines to Russia that were subsidized by population. And then they were getting cheap electricity that was subsidized by population from renewables, letting the population pay for those renewables. But this model is starting to get to an end because it's getting way too expensive, because the new forms of energy are much more difficult to transport. Electricity is harder to transport than coal or oil. Hydrogen is harder to transport than natural gas. So we will have to think about a new economic geography of the European Union. And I think if we think about security as Frank does, security, I cannot see it at a national level. I think Germany should not defend to the end of the day its steel industry, or Austria, if they cannot have a competitive energy supply. Because we can have competitive energy supplies in Spain and Finland, and maybe for some fuels, solar in Hungary, your state secretary mentioned as a very competitive supply. So two things. We need European grids, European markets to get energy as cheap as possible for all the countries, but we also need to think about whether some parts of the energy-intensive value chains can be reallocated within Europe, not sent to China, as the panelists in the first panel mentioned. So we can do it within Europe. That helps us to stay competitive and to at the same time maintain our security. But keeping everything as it used to be when we were digging out coal is not going to protect us, neither competitiveness nor security.
Frank, please.
Yeah, maybe I can add and put even more water into the wine somehow. It brings me back to what Paul mentioned with the small modular reactors. It brings me back to the discussion of nuclear. So I'm an untypical German, I have to say. I was in favor of extending the lifetimes of the last 7 nuclear reactors. I had never an ideological stance against that. But when it comes to building new ones, I'm also still a little bit skeptic. And that has to do with the commerciality. And I give you just few examples which really highlights. These are the hard figures which often are overlooked. The first US new nuclear reactor after more than 20 years started in July 2023 with a delay of 7 years and a cost overrun of $16 billion up to $30 billion. Finland, the nuclear reactor had been delayed for 14 years with a cost overrun of more than 8 billion over the budget. France, the EDF reactors, the cost rising, jumping up to, meanwhile, 67 billion. UK, Hinkley Point secret nuclear reactor is behind the schedule for many, many years, will not be operational before 2027. The latest assumption, what I heard, it could even not go into operation before 2036. Yeah, with 7,000 changes in the design and the cost overrun again by 35 billion. So there are much hopes of the small modular reactors, but whether they will translate into realities remains to be seen. What I have seen so far, that the present projects, the few projects which have begun, have faced the same problems with a huge cost overrun already. So there are uncertainties in this respect. I'm not against nuclear. I was hoping that the small modular reactors can be built, etc., and live up to all the promises the industry is hoping for. But here again, just a lot of uncertainties, and when you then think upon how much time it takes to build one before its operation starts, then we are already somewhere beyond 2035 in a market which we don't know. how the energy markets will operate. The same is the same is with hydrogen. We just started a project on hydrogen in reviewing the 2030 targets, which had been defined in the national hydrogen concept by Germany as well as by the EU, in a complete different geopolitical environment, in a complete different economic financial environment. But given you the huge demand for hydrogen imports, as we will not be in the position to produce everything ourselves, that will definitely lead also to complete geo-economic and geopolitical networks and ties and supply chains with new countries, with new superpowers. We don't know how they will look like, but we do have a chance in not making the same failures, in diversifying those imports as much as possible. But here again, a lot of uncertainties still exist when we are looking ahead and when we speak upon timeframes beyond 2035.
It is absolutely true. We just prepared at the ministry a short memo. In the last 20 years, we could not find any nuclear power plant that was finished on time and on budget, besides probably one in China, but we don't really know the exact figures there. But
just a short note. And in most of the cost analysis, just by taking that into account, in most of the cost analysis, the cost for storing waste are not included at all. The experience with Germany might be not the perfect example, is we included those costs, but we also experienced that the cost inclusion back 20 years ago was completely undermining those costs of storing the waste for a long, long time.
Well, please share our thoughts.
Let me say a few words about nuclear, a little bit about critical raw materials, a little bit about hydrogen, and then I want to build on what Georg said about who the winners are going to be. So in terms of nuclear, I think we need innovation. Innovation isn't necessarily nuclear. For exactly this reason. The industry has failed to ever deliver a project on cost and on budget, because even when it's a standard design, like Hinkley Point was supposed to be, I think it's actually now 10,000 design changes, not 7. It's fundamentally a redesign. The problem is, if you build everything one-off and bespoke, because people are so concerned about nuclear, and we'll see this with SMRs as well, it becomes a real challenge. Now, what I think is most interesting about nuclear right now is the project in Michigan, which is the first recommissioning project. So if you have a nuclear fleet that's been permitted and built, the idea of shutting them down is crazy. And the US is now trying for the first time to recommission a reactor that was shut down 2 years ago. And let's see if that's successful. There's been a consortium in the UK that's begun buying decommissioned reactors to recommission them. And I think that's a potentially interesting take on that. But innovation involves a lot more than that. I'll come back to that in a second. With respect to critical raw materials, I think part of what's important to appreciate is, we have gotten really, really good at finding liquids and gases in rocks. We are not very good at differentiating rocks from each other. So fundamentally, the geology and the geophysics of exploring for critical raw materials is more or less where the oil and gas industry was in the 1930s. Like you go for a walk, you look at an uplift, you count the layers, you try to guess what might be. However, there are a whole bunch of companies, Cobalt Metals is a good example, that are basically applying the West Texas toolkit of the 1970s to critical raw materials and finding them in places like Canada and Norway and so forth. And so I really don't, there certainly will be complicated supply chains. If you look at, for example, US diplomacy with the Cook Islands, that's a great example of one of those unfolding. But I think we really don't know yet, once we start looking for them, where these are going to be, but they certainly will be more places than just China. In terms of hydrogen, I think there's a more fundamental mistake with hydrogen, which is, hydrogen isn't an energy resource, it's an energy carrier. It's part of the electricity value chain. And we have to decide whether that we want to use hydrogen as part of our electricity value chain. But the idea that we set high targets for hydrogen fundamentally undermines one of the things I think that Europe does very well, which is a technology agnostic approach to the energy system that enables innovation. Picking hydrogen is picking a winner, as opposed to solving a problem. We have a whole bunch of problems for which hydrogen might be appropriate. We have a problem of seasonal storage. We potentially have a problem, I'm not sure we actually do, but some people think we have a problem of long distance imports of renewable energy. We have a problem of high temperature industrial applications. Hydrogen could solve those problems, but it's not a resource in the same way that electricity even is, we could consider a resource. It's a mode of energy. And that brings me on to the point that Georg made around who the winners are going to be. One of the fallacies that I think we make in thinking about the energy transition is we say we used to have molecules, now we're going to have electrons. In actual fact, we don't consume electrons in our plug socket. We consume an alternating electromagnetic current, and that alternating current has extremely specific operating parameters. So in order to keep the system live and healthy, we have to be at 50 hertz at all the time with a plus or minus 1% boundary. So electricity is generated and consumed in exactly the same moment. That means, as we heard earlier in the Finnish example, prices can move enormously because excess generation is as harmful as undergeneration. And Germany curtailed, I think last year, 6 terawatt hours of wind, in part because of frequency, of avoiding excessive frequency. That means that historically that wasn't a problem because the power plant could adjust its output dynamically, and our lives were pretty boring and synchronized. And they would watch football in the control room and see how many minutes of added time and call the power station to start shoveling coal because you knew when added time was over, people would open the refrigerator. Today we live in a totally different world. So I would argue that one of the things that will determine the winners is who is willing first to move from an idea that industry needs to think about thermal efficiency and 24-hour power to the idea that industry needs to optimize around dispatchability and taking advantage of negatively priced power. And the countries that can do that first will be the industrial winners of the transition.
Well, we see that AI is coming into this field in a great extent. That some countries are arbitrating the options, in the market. That you see the amplitude of 1,000 euros within a day, basically. That was unprecedented before, and because of the renewables, basically. And turning to the third question, that is concerning the renewables, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, in 2019 presented the European Green Deal as one of the major political tools and achievements of hers, and she described this as a man on the moon momentum. It got a lot of criticism and a lot of support, and of course today or nowadays the kind of industry deal concept is emerging as many felt left out of this huge project. And the most affected, arguably, are the heavy industries and the agriculture that need to cope with this green transition. So my question would be how you see the role of renewables, what are the prospects, what are the difficulties, and what Europe can do about this. Let's do it, Paul.
Two things. First, I'll answer the question in a second, but this man on the moon analogy is ridiculous. Putting the man on the moon was a one-off effort to do something at unlimited cost with very low reliability. The space shuttle even had a 30% targeted failure rate. We don't want an energy system with a 30% targeted failure rate. Draghi is I think Draghi is right to say this is a lot more like the Marshall Plan. It's building an industrial base. And that means it has to be reliable. It has to be a system that can be rolled out across society. It's not a moonshot. And I think that analogy has been extremely unhelpful. What I would say about renewables, and I think this is important, is the cheapest energy in the world today from a marginal cost perspective is renewable energy, right? You're at incredibly low costs. The problem is not the cost of renewable energy. The problem is the cost of making the Tesla Westinghouse system work with renewable energy. And we keep saying, renewables are expensive. Renewables aren't expensive. It's that when you have lots of renewables, stabilizing the grid is expensive. Why is that the case? In part because when we started the transition, it was a policy-driven disruption. And the policy was to build renewables, and the assumption was the grid would catch up. You know, the policymaker, I think, is realizing, and we see this clearly in the Draghi report, that in order for European citizens or citizens anywhere to benefit from the zero marginal cost nature of renewables, we need the infrastructure to support them. You know, and in turn, I think innovation, including our company, has turned to the question of, you know, how do we adapt the grid to function with 100% renewable energy? Once that project is finished, the cost of energy we will look back on the energy transition as a major driver of growth because the cost of energy will have collapsed. You know, we're in an awkward transition point now. A little bit like when we started using oil and we didn't have pipelines and we had to send it in canisters. And shipping oil around the world in liter canisters was not a very efficient thing to do, and it was very expensive. But the infrastructure was developed and the price collapsed.
Firstly, just one point. What we forgot in terms of the nuclear is one of the dimensions which we didn't want to talk about. And that's a heavy European, but also for me, surprisingly, I didn't know that before, the US dependence on Russia's Rosatom nuclear fuel dependency. Nobody really wants to talk about that. Meanwhile, I'm looking forward, the US and European companies and the governments have decided to build up alternative nuclear supply chains, but that will also take time. Yeah, and it's also a cost issue. Yeah, what we have to invest there, this money won't be available somewhere else. Just to mention that, because this is another geopolitical dependence hardly being addressed by governments and the industry. Secondly, you mentioned that the problem are not the costs of the renewables themselves, but to make the system work. Yeah, give you two figures. Germany had, should have 10 years ago, starting with modernizing, expanding, digitalizing the existing grids to make them smart grids, so to speak. The investment costs have been estimated running up to between 200, 300 billion euro alone for Germany. The EU Commission has estimated the European grids, but this is only part of the grids, is running up to almost 700 billion. Yeah, we do have in Germany every year we celebrate actually, the capacity increase of renewable-based electricity, and that's fine. The problem is that part of this newly added capacity cannot be transported to the consumers. Yeah, we do have a situation where regions and cities are a part of the city at the moment. They can't, for example, connect even more heating pumps or electric vehicles. You have supply security blackouts. Yeah, and these dangers will increase in the years ahead because we have not, in a timely manner, modernized our grids. And that shows how these things are interrelated. And when figures being celebrated, it's completely ignore the entire system analysis. Yeah, and that looks very, very different. So grid the modernization of the grid, the huge investment you need, digitalize them, will be, in my humble opinion, the foremost task to make the system work. And we have neglected that for almost 10, 15 years about it. And this is also true here in Central Europe, where you have much debates between do we should stay for some years with coal, do we should not invest enough in renewables, etc. But this is only part of the story and the challenges you face, like we do. And you need to be realistic what can be done in a specific time frame. And unfortunately, the German highest court has made a decision in 2035 that the state budget is not in line with the constitution, which reduced the state budget in Germany by 60 billion. And meanwhile, many of the energy projects can no longer be financed. The government is forced to make clear priorities, and that's politically very sensitive, and it's unwilling to do that. Yeah, the same goes with the European Commission. The European Commission has already redefined budgets away from the energy and climate sector to security defense. And I think this is indeed also be needed. But in the years ahead, with a different kind of European Commission, an even more different kind of a European Parliament, industrial competitiveness, cost efficiency will play a much, much more prominent and important role for the years to come. And to get a little bit more realistic. This does not mean that the Green Deal will end or we will completely giving up all these political agreed targets. Yeah, although some of those targets might be no longer realistic, such as in the hydrogen sector, at least for the targets of 2030. Yeah, but I want just to highlight to which extent the also economic financial conditions in Europe have changed just to 2-3 years ago, and further changes can be predicted in a certain way will take place, but in which direction in 2-3 years, almost nobody can really forecast that.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me put my economist hat on and kind of confront you with a dilemma that we have with the implementation of our energy and climate targets. On the one hand, we have the perfect tool. We have carbon pricing rolled out, efficient incentives for everybody to do the right thing through the system because it gives the right signal from the power plant, power sector, switch between coal and gas, between gas and electricity for heat pumps. So it optimizes a very big system across the whole of the European Union, across all sectors. So it's, for an economist, it's perfect. On the other hand, we have the challenge that member states cannot accept, or people cannot accept the results of that because there are huge price increases for individual goods that people cannot quickly substitute away from. So if your heating prices increase extremely strongly, you're not going to get elected the next time in the election. If some poorer people cannot kind of move to buy an electric vehicle to get out of there, or if farmers don't find a way to reduce the emissions, there is a challenge. So what we start doing is a lot of micromanagement of these policies. But if we do them very strongly, they are going to be also extremely inefficient. And we see that. We have all this, I mean, Draghi is complaining about tens of thousands of regulations at the European level. And if you look into the Green Deal, it's full of that. And member states add to this. So we are in this dilemma between, on the one hand, there is a nice tool which is impossible for distributional reasons. So therefore, we are going for this massive amount of regulation to try to kind of target each one at its marginal price point, to put it in very economic jargon, to get them to do what they need to do without having any extra cost. And that is a challenge that we are going to live with in the next decade. I think the mix of the two will remain the main policy level. I think that carbon pricing will essentially be the threat to policymakers to act on the individual elements. So the threat of the emission trading system too, so the price for households and transportation that is looming. People say that if nothing is happening, it's going to 200 euros per ton, and that is going to be like an energy price shock that we have seen in the past years for households. That is not going to be acceptable for policymakers. So therefore, policymakers are going to come in on their national level with regulation, with doing heating plans in Germany, with rolling out district heating, and all member states are doing something. But we are confronted with this very challenging dilemma between kind of, do we want the efficient system with carbon pricing, or do we want to go into micromanagement? At the end of the day, if you would be able to have carbon pricing and then redistribute the money that we receive to the people that would be really in need, that would be the ideal system, but it's going to be very complicated, and member states love to complain about how unfair the system is, but they pocket in their carbon pricing revenues and not redistributing it to the population, but then they complain about Brussels. So it's the perfect stage for each national member state to essentially kind of blame it on Brussels, but take the money. A second point on lowering the cost. I mentioned before that how important the internal market has been, and we recently published a paper that turned around the motto power in unity to unity in power. And we are arguing in this paper that if we would be able to create a really functioning European electricity market that ensures that the renewables are produced where most of the renewables are, that ensures that we have as little backup available to back up our European system, if we ensure that we have geographic averaging of renewables across the region, so if the sun is not shining in one region, maybe it's compensated by wind from another region, then we could save maybe 5 to, at best, maybe 20% of our system cost, which is even in a macroeconomic dimension. So it is a really significant amount of money that we could save with going for a European level. What we need for that, in my view, is more coordination. We need a joint vision of what the data are, what we need to understand who plans what power plants. We have the NECPs, but I'm not sure how much Hungary has communicated its NECP to its neighbors. Germany did not communicate its NECP to its neighbors, so the National Energy and Climate Plan. So we are not coordinating on what we are doing here. Investment in our power system is not coordinated across borders. That's leaving a lot of money on the table. If we could be better at that, we could lower the electricity prices quite significantly. We need better markets to function. We need more grids, as Beata said before, and we need trust between the member states to make it work. But I think it's one of the relatively low-hanging fruits if we want to get cheaper energy in Europe, is getting the internal market to a completely different level from the level we are currently at.
Thank you very much. Well, just to answer quickly to your question, our Austrian friends asked for our plan, but we are still waiting for theirs. They haven't sent us yet. But I think it would be the task of the Commission to organize this. I mean, if you have 27 stakeholders, it's probably not a good idea to wait until they share their knowledge and plans with each other if you have the authority to actually ask them to do so. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your really exciting and thorough thoughts. We still have some time, a little bit of time for questions, so I would open it up. And please just raise your hand and indicate your name and affiliation if possible. And a colleague is coming with the microphone so everybody can hear your questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Vladimir Sokor, Jamestown Foundation. Switching to oil for a moment. What are the prospects with advantages or disadvantages for oil refineries in Hungary and Slovakia importing crude oil from Croatia's Omišalj terminal via the Janaf pipeline? Thank you.
As a moderator, I don't feel that I'm in the position to answer this, but if anyone would like to reflect to the question.
I think we discussed the issues here not just on the Hungarian side. This is a big issue in the Commission too. In which way, under which time frame, Hungary can diversify its oil imports. So Croatia played from the very beginning a role. The problem is also on the technical side in a way because oil is not oil. There are different kind of qualities. Not every refinery can use all kind of oil qualities. Yeah, so that needs to be taken into account. If you import oil from different kind of sources, different kind of countries, then the quality of oil is different. What came so far from Russia? Yeah, so that needs to be taken into account. Yeah, but as I said before, like in the LNG sector, there are challenges. Yeah, there are cost issues included, but at the very end, the question boils down whether there is a political will, whether there is a political strategic interest to diversify or not. When I'm looking to the LNG debate, for example, I find it somehow strange, or there are opportunities too. Yeah, because we will enter either next year or the following year a new decade of an LNG oversupply for at least almost 10 years. Beyond, there's an open question. There's an open question related to new production sites in the US, whether they will be invest now and whether that LNG gas will be available by 2035, but we will enter a global oversupply. To which extent we can debate, but there are new opportunities. There are a number of African countries. Kuwait will begin to produce a new huge field, etc. So in terms of diversification options, there are will be much more options available from the year 2000, probably 2026. And the forecast is also that it may decrease the prices on the market globally. Yeah, that's maybe not the best incentive for the industry. But that could, economically speaking, for the rest of the economy and Europe's economic, hopefully, revival, a good starting point. But this is not an issue where no diversification options are available, including not options for Hungary, Slovakia, and Austria.
Yeah, just if I can jump in for a second, availability is really important, and I totally agree with you. The other question is then the transit fee and all the other. Then we hope that it's going to be lower too.
Yeah, let me make one kind of higher level comment on that, because what you're alluding to is the challenge of we are having selective sanctions on Russian oil imports. Some countries get oil, some countries don't get oil. This is creating imbalances in the internal market, which is a challenge. And the way that we saw it with oil sanctions, in my way, was an ill-conceived way, imposed potentially on us also by the US. I thought we should have gone much better for a tariff on Russian oil, because what we are currently seeing is that we are essentially re-importing oil from India. We are closing bands between India and Russia. We are forging them together by not allowing us to deal with Russia. And if we would have said, okay, Russia is allowed to export oil to the European Union, but instead of a price cap on the oil that goes somewhere which is not working extremely well, we would put extremely high tariffs on the oil that they are still sending via pipeline. We would have to see how much oil that then would still be coming to us, and we would then receive this additional rent that we can use to support, for example, Ukraine, or do other good things with. So I think, I don't know whether there will be an opportunity at one moment, maybe after the new administration in the US takes over, to rethink the question of whether this price cap mechanism that leads to shadow fleets, all sorts of dirty businesses, dangerous ships, deals between Russia and partners that we would like to be partner with, towards a system where we say, okay, we put a clean price cap, clean tariff on that. The money is used for something good, and that's, in this very cynical world, maybe the cleanest way we could deal with that.
Thank you very much. There was Dora, please.
Thank you. My name is Dora Czernusz. I'm a director for climate issues at Equilibrium Institute. And my question would be about when we are talking about energy security in general, and also here in our conversations, we're talking about diversification and about renewables, but we talk, I think we don't talk enough about energy efficiency and the reduction of final energy consumption. And don't you think that the focus should be put more on this issue also, as the EU's, one of the EU's energy mottos is energy efficiency first? And if yes, what do you think, how could we put more emphasis on the question of energy efficiency? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yes, certainly would agree is the cheapest energy is the energy which you don't use. Yeah, so energy efficiency certainly already plays also a very important role, at least in comparison with other countries and other regions. So Germany, together with Japan, is probably the most energy efficient country for many, many years, when you take statistics. Yeah. So the only problem is if Europe is already a kind of leader together with Japan in terms of energy efficiency, the possibility to increase our energy efficiency and reducing CO2 emission in comparison with other countries and regions is rather small. Yeah, you would gain also in terms for global climate policies much more if you would increase the energy efficiency in China, including in the US, as well as in many, many other countries and regions. Yeah, this does not say that we shouldn't do something, but just highlighting that in terms of comparing that internationally. My guess is, Georg, you may contradict, but my guess is that energy efficiency will further play a role. Take the example of hydrogen. Electrolysis, for example, is extremely inefficient. You need a huge amount of renewables, which we can even not build up in our countries because of population density, even admitted in the German hydrogen strategy, and that results in the huge hydrogen import demand forecast because of the energy efficiency built into that kind of green technology, of green hydrogen. The same problem you have when you transport hydrogen. You lose a lot of energy actually when you start, let's say, transporting hydrogen from Africa or Saudi Arabia, things, which also means we need a lot of still technological innovation in this field to make also the new technology options much more energy efficient, and not all of the green energy technologies we have available up today are energy efficient as a technology so much. So here again, the time frame to what needs to be done and what can be done in a realistic framework, that's something where we have to be a little bit, in my humble opinion, a little bit more pragmatic.
Let me just add one thing on this, which I think is important, which is that, we need to move from a mindset that's fundamentally thermal. Like in the world of thermal energy, storage is cheap and energy is expensive. Okay, we are moving from a thermal system to an electrical system where energy is cheap and storage is expensive. So we need to move, when we talk about efficiency, historically it meant reducing the peak. Today it's about flexibility. And I think actually the Commission's doing a good job and EUCERS is doing a good job of encouraging a dialogue about what are the technologies to support flexibility. If we want to build up renewables, we need to be able to shift demand to the large periods we'll find of negative prices. So we need a different mindset around efficiency that matches the physics of our system, instead of transposing the physics of the old system onto the new system and the mindset that came with that physics. And I worry that's what we're doing when we focus on reducing demand as opposed to moving demand to match supply.
Thank you very much. If we want to max it out, we've got 2.5 more minutes for a short question, and please, short answer.
Thank you. I am András Lukács from the Clean Air Action Group, a Hungarian environmental association. Green transition also needs a lot of energy, for example, mining or of various raw materials, or we can see in Hungary the battery factories which consume a lot of energy, fossil fuel energy. So how to deal with this? Because we need to reduce CO2 emission as quickly as possible, but at the same time, as I said, the green transformation also needs a lot of fossil fuel energy. So how will to solve this problem?
Yeah, it does. I mean, we need to build a whole new infrastructure. The question is about how do we, the faster we build that infrastructure, the quicker we can start reducing emissions at scale. And I think also the more that we're technology agnostic. So you're right, batteries take a lot of energy to produce. And if we're talking about lithium-ion batteries, they're extremely expensive in lots of different ways. They're difficult to recycle. But if we really take a technology agnostic approach, You know, there's a trade-off between investing in the distribution grid to support more chargers and making bigger lithium-ion batteries for cars. You know, we can address that on two different sides. There's a trade-off between flexibility that lets the grid adjust load and putting batteries in the grid to provide storage. You know, if we're genuinely technology agnostic about how to solve that, we can solve a lot of these problems in ways that require less battery and more innovation, not both regulatory innovation and technology innovation.
Please go ahead.
Just to the point of Paul, I think beyond the technology innovation and the needs we do have, I think we need to be also more honest in many other ways. Yeah, I was just talked about the raw materials and the demand growth and etc. So for many years we actually, as experts, accepted we also need to use domestic or European mining. But still, the same NGOs who have protested against nuclear, protesting against coal, are protesting against European mining. Yeah, and European mining would not just enhance the supply security and creating new jobs. It would also decrease global emissions, because every mining outside of Europe, whether that's taking place in Africa or China, under completely different environment regulation, will always produce much more global emissions. And then you have to add those emissions for the transport on ships, etc. So this is an issue which I try to talk also with my own environment ministry and also with NGOs, and there's a real political unwillingness to talk about these things. Yeah? Sometimes they don't recognize that, but very often they recognize it, and they recognize it contradicts their own policies. Environment ministries, big NGOs, doesn't want to annoy their own, let's say, local environmental groups, which constantly protesting against also building new grids, building electrolysis stations, and particularly being against European mining. So here again, public acceptance and persuading is something, also self-critical reflection of your arguments is sometimes which you need. And that's not just a governmental task, it's also some kind of responsibility of the NGOs themselves.
Absolutely, and sometimes it's not, you don't even necessary to get involved big NGOs, because NIMBY movement are typically smaller communities which you know, they also need to be heard if their interest is heard. We are minus 2.40 seconds. I'm not sure if we can still continue if the organizers say one more question then. Nobody's opposing, so just one more really short question, please. And
it's a very short question. My name is László Pankas from Elmon, Hungary. And I ask you that it is possible to restart the nuclear power plant in Germany, because as I know, they were closed before their lifetime, technically.
So from a technical point of view, you can do that. Whether you can do that on, I think that there's a constitutional law which is complicated in a certain way, but the biggest problem would be the political stance against it. Yeah, the present Lighthouse Coalition, for example, in particular the Green Party, because Mr. Habeck had become much more pragmatic. So we extended the lifetimes of 3 nuclear power plants for 6 months over a winter time. That was already extremely difficult in the Green Party, but at the very end he got the support. Yeah, but it was also clear that afterwards the rest of the party would not even extend in the further lifetimes. Whether you could imagine some kind of a new coalition which would completely change these things remains to be seen, because any new government which would emerge over the coming years will be a coalition government involving 2 or 3 parties. So therefore I have some doubts, even when in the Christ Democratic Party, for example, there is a greater willingness. but whether they would restart, I mean, they have also favored the extension of the last 7 nuclear reactors, yeah. But if they would now come to a government, if they would then also support of a restarting with the constitutional problems being involved and some other issues, we do have also a problem of shortage of workers, not just, by the way, in Germany, which you then also need to operate nuclear power plants. You have to train them. Most of them in the existing ones have already left. They are older ones. Yeah. Here again, you need to have those people with the skills which can operate the nuclear power plants after you have phased out the things. And training also takes time.
I buy you a very expensive bottle of wine if one of them is going to be reopened.
Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you once again, gentlemen, for your thoughts. I think it was really fruitful, and we heard a lot of interesting points you made. Unfortunately, our time is up, and we have to close the workshop. But it was a great pleasure listening to you, and thank you for the audience as well for the questions. And see you later. And I think the chat can go on in an informal way. Thank you.